Well, it's been talking to myself, but basically I've just used the friction tool that lifted that ring out straight away, no arguments. Lifted off this, which is the bayonet here is to hold a lens hood. Lifted that off, got down as far as this, removed our 3 screws and washers which hold our lens capsule into the mount. That should come out. So there's our lens capsule. Here is the focus helical. That moves quite smoothly, just a hint of grittiness to it. Knowing that somebody had daubed some black paint on here suggests that possibly that lens has seen some attention in the past. Yet everything looks very clean. I can take the rest of this to pieces. 4 screws at the back. One of them here is painted red, and that's the alignment mark there when you're putting your lens back on the camera. As with the screws that hold the lens mount on the camera, if you have an ugly screw because you've made a mess of it, the ugly screw is then selected to be painted with red paint. So you put the ugly screw in that position and you cover the head of it with red paint when you're done. And the 3 better screws go in the positions where there is no paint. Okay, so that should come off. This is a Reflex 4 of course, so we're late in the production time. There is no rangefinder coupling. Earlier lenses had a rangefinder coupling, so you could use the lens on a Retina 3S for example. Okay, so here we've got this piece. Now take note of the order that these pieces come off. This shim and the way they are up. Here we go, now we're getting into the tricky stuff. This piece is a pin under here which couples to a piece underneath. So I've just lifted that off there. This has the larger of the 2 springs. There are 2 springs in here, one's smaller, one's larger diameter. To take note of which one went where, because if you don't, things won't go well. Take this one, this is our other next depth of field pointer. That can come off, well the first one as we enter. There's that little cam piece that the pin on this dropped into that hole there. Unhook this spring. There's a spacer here that separates the 2 depth of field pointers. Here's our other depth of field pointer. Now normally I like to get this spring off if I can, because it's easily damaged. So yeah, that's lifted off for me. It doesn't always want to come off. It's one of those things that it's not worth fighting with it if it doesn't want to come off. Rubbish day here today, that's the recycling truck. If it doesn't want to come off, leave it alone. You're better to leave it there than damage it yourself, trying to save it from being damaged. There are 4 screws hold these little brass clamps in place, which in turn clamp down this plastic ring which holds the lens together. Typically you only need to remove the 3 easy ones. The other one is a post that the spring hooks to, which makes it awkward because you need a screwdriver with a hole down the centre of or a slot down the middle to clear the centre of that post. But generally speaking, you can get away with just removing the 3. Okay, so as you can see, as I pull this back, I can drop the lens out from underneath. And this edge here is what runs into this little groove on the lens and holds all this together. So these parts are all fairly clean anyway, but I'm going to clean these carefully. I may or may not have to remove that post. I can see someone's had trouble with it in the past because it's got scratches on it, which is a sure sign that somebody had inappropriate tools and was finding it tough. Okay, I'll clean these components and get ready to put this back together. Everything will just get cleaned with naphtha, cigarette lighter fluid, and there's a minimal amount of lubrication required on these parts. I can start putting this back together. I'm just going to put a very slight wipe of molybdenum paste on that surface. That's the surface with those holes on it. Then aligning these two pieces, make sure that you start aligning it where the numbers line up with the register. I need to get this piece hooked under there, of course, and pull back those two pieces. That's moving smoothly, and I can put these little clamps in place. Now these clamps have got a rebate in them where they fit over that plastic, the edge of the plastic. So I'll get those in place and run the screws up. I'm not doing them up tight at this stage, I'm just getting them in position. None of these parts were particularly grimy, but I've cleaned them all with naphtha regardless. And as a result they'll work. They should work better. Now everything was working fairly well to start off with. Unless I'd had a good reason to take it apart, and in this case that was simply because that's part and parcel of the servicing job I'm doing, I wouldn't have probably bothered. If this was my camera, a lens from my camera, I wouldn't have looked twice at it, I would have used it exactly as it was. Right, so I'm just checking the action here. What I'm doing is checking to make sure that there's no play, no perceptible play here, which would tell me that these brackets weren't, because they're wedge shaped, basically it would mean that the brackets weren't firm enough. They weren't, there's a bit of rattle that way. Get that plate sitting over that plastic piece better, that's better. And basically they should be rattle free but still move freely without any undue friction. That's good. It's got a nice smooth action. It's not a loose feel, but there's no undue friction. So that's all good. I can start assembling all the other stuff. Right, well, we can start with this depth of field pointer. This is the first one to go in. Where's my post? My post is there. So I know it goes there. This should drop over there. And it actually drops down to the lower of the two gear sets. We have the spacer that keeps these two pieces apart. There's a notch in this plastic fence that holds that arm. It just stops that from rotating. I've got that fine spring. Got to get that over the post. Getting it over the post is almost but not quite as difficult as taking it off the post. You can see the spring's got a slight kink in it. Probably not enough to cause any problems. And I'll get that spring hooked over the projection on that depth of field pointer. So that depth of field pointer is now sprung loaded. Next I've got this little plastic cam piece that moves in this little track. So I'm just putting a wipe of molybdenum paste down there. Whatever you use, you need to use it sparingly. You don't want things getting sticky. This just sits on there like that. Our second depth of field pointer drops down into here. It should sit over the pin on that piece. It should need to make sure that our depth of field pointers are hard up against the ends of their stops, which means this one probably wants to come across another tooth. That looks even. And we have this piece. The pin here needs to go down in the hole of that little cam. Like that. And the spring needs to hook over that post. That looks good. Okay, now I've got some special screws that I've got with no heads, which I'm going to use as guideposts to hold all this in place while I close it up. Now these screws have simply had the heads ground back on them so that they're essentially like a threaded rod with a slot in the end so that I can engage a screwdriver. And 3 is sufficient, I don't need to use 4. I don't screw them in too far because otherwise they'd get caught on things. This shim goes on here. And then this piece goes on here. The tabs stick up and the notch in it runs past this tab here. At that stage, because there's no rangefinder coupling to worry about, I've only got to get this over the top, line it up with those 3 screws, now this tab on this side often gets caught under there, so I pulled that back with my fingernail. It immediately fell into place. And I can check the action, make sure that moves freely. Now holding this firmly between finger and thumb so nothing moves, I can check the action of my depth of field pointers by moving the ring here at the back to check that they come up evenly in the middle, that they're even. That tells me that I haven't got one of the rings out of position. And of course I can start putting the screws in the back to hold all this together. Since we only had 3 guide post screws in there, it's easy to get the first screw in. Once that's in place, do the other screws one at a time. As soon as you have 2 screws in, basically nothing's going to fall apart. The painted screw can go back where the painted screw came from. And the shiny nickel plated screw can go in the other position. Okay, well, I can check the action. The focus action is smooth, depth of field pointers move freely, that mechanism is nice and free. This piece here, which would set the set aperture onto the lens, that's all clear. That's what opens the aperture to full aperture when you're viewing, really. Sorry. Okay, so this piece, the lens capsule. I'm having a quick look at this, making sure that the diaphragm moves smoothly. You're best not to let this fly back with a snap. The diaphragm, the blades are quite thin. The rivets that form the pivot points on them are very tiny, and they can tear out reasonably easily. I'm looking at those blades. There's some mark of oil on those blades, but not sufficient to make it worthwhile chasing that. You're more likely to do more damage than good chasing a small problem like that. The blades are somewhat delicate. I'd rarely take those diaphragms completely apart in any case. I would normally clean them in place with lots of naphtha, lots of cotton buds, and it's very time consuming getting them nice and clean. One of the things that you have to watch when you're cleaning a diaphragm in place like that is that the naphtha that you put on there will stick the blades together almost as efficiently as oil would, so that as you're working the blades open and closed and swabbing them and so forth, you could actually damage those blades if you go to move their position and the naphtha has managed to lock those blades together. And it certainly can. It's just much less likely to happen than with oil. Well, that looks good. I'll clean the piece here. This is all quite clean as these things go. I'm going to re-lubricate this with some helical grease, but that's all very clean as these things go. It wasn't causing a problem. I wouldn't expect it to cause a problem looking like that. It's much more common for this to be filled with dry and dirty grease that's full of dust and rubbish that has been absorbed into it. That looks good. Now I'm checking the feel of that on the thread, and that's nice and smooth. Sometimes you'll get a rough patch, sometimes that's because there's still a bit of embedded dried grease in there, and an answer can be to roll this almost all the way off the thread, put a bit of solvent on there, and then work it backwards and forwards, and the one component will clean the detritus out of the other component, or at least loosen it up, so that you can then go back in with another round with the cotton bud and lift out the freshly loosened problem. You've got to watch when you're cleaning up this that you're not leaving any cotton threads behind, because cotton threads lying stuck on the end of a thread, lens thread, could easily make the action very stiff too. That's great, that's working just as it should do. I'm going to clean these glass surfaces now, the two I can get to easily, so that I can look into the lens and judge whether I need to remove the lenses completely in order to check them or not. I mean, generally speaking, you don't need to open them up. But it's only once you've got the outside cleaned that you can really judge what's happening there. So I'm just using glass cleaner on these. It looks very good. I've got the window light coming in from beside me, and I can judge from the reflections on the surface of the glass how successful or otherwise I've been at getting rid of any smears. That looks good. Okay, well, that capsule is ready to be lubricated and put back into the mount now. Well, I've got a couple, this couples to the mount in two spots. One is here where the guide post runs, that basically stops this from revolving in the mount. And here is where our coupling for the aperture runs. So I'm just giving them a wipe with molybdenum paste so that they're not going to provide any significant friction, and that everything should move smoothly. Now this is some helical grease. This is Helimax XP optical and instrument helical grease. And like all these things, it's reasonably expensive, but a little goes a very long way. I don't need to put much on here. I'm putting it on in about half a dozen spots around the outside. There is no benefit in putting lots of grease on a helical thread. Generally speaking, all it will do is make the action stiffer. That's good, that moves nice and freely. Right, I'm going to put this, take that off for the moment. I'm going to put this lens capsule back into the body. What I've got to do is line up the aperture tab, settings tab with that, and that piece with there. So I can move my aperture tab there from the outside, of course. I'm going to get these two pieces as lined up as close as possible. With this particular lens model, typically you can get the aperture coupling in and then rotate the lens slightly to get the other piece in. Yep, that's it. So that's dropped into place. You can see I can open the aperture up all the way in the back. Okay, well that's good. Now, being careful not to drop this on the bench and knock the whole lens back through. And put the front piece in place, the outer focus helical. Just run that down. Now with my focus scale turned around to the infinity position and the lens reasonably well back in the mount, I can put my 3 washers and fixing screws in place. And because I'm putting this on a reflex camera and I'd already checked the lens on the camera body prior to taking it apart, I know that the focus was correct on the focus screen. And so I can use my focus screen to make my alignment of the lens focus to put it back exactly where it came from, or exactly where it should be. Of course, with this particular camera, I've also been careful to set the lens mount to film plane distance correctly. But there was, I noted that the standard lens certainly produced the correct image at the screen, at the infinity position. So I'm just checking the action of this. And I'll get this positioned correctly so that I can try the lens on the camera. And set the focus. There's the camera body. I'll just look out the window and see where this is. Right, at that point the image is aligned in the finder at an infinity target. So if I loosen these 3 screws off, move my focus scale ring round to the infinity stop, tighten those screws and check the action to make sure nothing's shifted, I should be in business. That's it. That focus is correct. The action is nice and smooth. Our front ring here, the lens hood mount, that goes on. There's a tab on this, as I probably previously mentioned, which drops into a point up in here. Here it is to stop that rotating. Here is the retaining ring, which was difficult to get out because somebody had painted it in place. And I'll see if I can get my friction tool to tighten that up. I think that was it. No, I need a bit more than that. That's it. So there we have it. The lens is back together, nice and clean, moving smoothly, and the camera is now complete, and that can go back to its owner, and I'm sure they'll be very pleased to see it. So Reflex 4, no serious issues other than those that had been introduced. The most serious issue with this camera was that somebody had removed these 3 screws, shifted the position of these rings sufficient that this tab here was hard up against its stop. It couldn't come back any further, and so that the shutter action could not complete. There's no way that could have happened by itself. That's just impossible. Stuff just can't jump a tooth. There's just no room for it to do that. So somebody certainly had those 3 screws out. Whether they did it while investigating the possibility of opening up the shutter from the front to deal with the existing shutter problem, because the shutter certainly was in need of servicing, we'll never know. But that's most likely the case. Then they would have decided that no, actually you can't get in the front into the shutter from the front, which if they'd bothered to do their research they would have already discovered. Put the rings back, the rings went back in the incorrect position. After that the shutter didn't even work in the less than ideal way it had worked previously. It just simply failed to work at all. It made noises like it was going to work. It certainly made the right clicks, but instead of the shutter blades closing, the mirror swinging up out of the way, the capping plate swinging out of the way, the diaphragm closing to the set aperture, the shutter blades then opening again and closing to make the exposure, the shutter blades simply stayed stuck closed at the first position. You could have put a film in there, run it right through, you'd be none the wiser, and when you got your film back from the processor, it would have come with a sad tale that the film was unexposed. Anyway, that's a Reflex 4. Thanks for watching.